So I will briefly do a bit of a recap of how we got here. So in January, we ran a snap survey to understand the impact of COVID on the Christmas business and the outlook over the coming months at that point. Some of you may have very kindly completed that survey as well or have seen the results. But it was very successful from our point of view, with around 200 responses, which is about a fifth of our institutional membership. And that meant that when we talked to government and funders about what was happening with our members, we knew that we were well informed and that we were telling them exactly what was going on with independent museums around the country. I think that feels like a long time ago now, certainly does for us at AIM. And over spring and summer, of course, the main challenge for the sector, and what I know for some of you, for some of our members, is turning out to be a challenge over and above that presented by COVID, has emerged with the energy crisis. So the cost of living pressures, which are affecting staff, volunteers, visitors, and operating and capital project costs, and a new gift in recent weeks, a wobbling economy as well. So we came out with another SNAP survey. It was open for just over 2 weeks, which proved to be quite a strange 2 weeks after the Queen's death, but on we went. It was a comprehensive survey. We know it was quite detailed, so we are really grateful to everybody who took the time to fill out some or all of it and let us know what's going on with you. It is such a massive issue, or combination of issues, across all sectors at the moment, and we knew that we were going to be the first museums body to get our survey out. We are, as you probably all know, a pragmatic organisation. So we haven't been kind of precious about any of this. We did share drafts of the survey with other sector bodies and with the Arts Council, and we asked DCMS what questions they were looking to have answered, and then we tweaked parts of the survey to ensure that we were asking for information that would be useful. And we have shared results widely across other sector bodies and with funders as well, so that others can see the numbers and use the numbers. We had just under 350 responses, which is about a third of our institutional membership this time. And that says to us how big the problems out there are and how much you want to be heard. That's a big responsibility for us at AIM, and I will talk a bit more towards the end of the presentation about how we're using your information and what we're doing with it next. We've got 345 responses. I will say that not everybody completed the whole survey, and we know there were some detailed questions on there which were pretty hard to answer if you didn't have the information right to hand. So most questions have a meaningful sample of about 200. The vast majority of responses, 292, were from museums in England. There were 33 from Scotland, 18 from Wales, and 2 from Northern Ireland. We have provided some analysis to the Welsh Government on those respondents, and we will be doing the same for museums, galleries, Scotland, so that they understand exactly what's going on in their countries. It's 207 small museums, about 60% of respondents. That's about the same proportion as our membership. Small to us is up to 20,000 visitors annually. We'll know 48 medium museums, that's about 6 of respondents, up to 50,000 visitors in our categorisation. 26 large museums, that's up to 100,000 visitors, and 30 largest museums, which is over 100,000 visitors. The other respondents were either not AIM members or our suppliers, and there was also 8 individuals who answered. 3/4 of respondents were independent museums, 256 of them, another 11 independent but trusts spun out of local authorities. About 1 in 6 was a local authority, university or military museum, which will become relevant later. An interesting point, given that we are talking about energy costs, just over a third of respondents did say that they do typically close over winter, and those museums actually said that they were less likely to be able to absorb the impact of increased costs in the short term compared to museums that do stay open over winter. I would guess it may be that those museums' fixed costs during their period of closure are well known, but while they're closed, they can't do anything to try to mitigate them. That is something I'm interested in knowing more about. One of the things we really wanted to understand was, how was summer? We know, of course, that the summer holidays are very busy periods for most museums. And for many of you, that income is really relied on going into winter, which is typically quieter, apart from a few weeks over Christmas. We know as well, a lot of museums were pinning a lot of hopes on summer after 2 years of being affected in varying degrees by COVID. And we found it was a mixed summer, and that mixed outlook is a theme that will recur across the rest of the presentation. For about 40 to 50% of respondents, summer was as good as or better than expected. That 40 to 50 is because income was as expected or better for slightly more respondents than visitors were. And that chimes with something that we've been hearing anecdotally, which is that spend per head is up in retail and hospitality in a lot of museums. And we didn't ask about spend per head, so maybe we will next time, but because it does feel like something potentially quite interesting is going on there. Possibly audiences are getting skewed more towards more economically privileged people with more disposable income. Maybe people of all backgrounds are kind of treating a museum over summer as a big day out or a highlight and splashing out on it, rather than going to a more expensive attraction or even going abroad. One thing that we had added was asking whether visitors tend to arrive to museums by car, on public transport, or on foot. And that was a pretty rough way of trying to test something else we were hearing anecdotally, which is that more rural museums were having a more difficult summer, probably because of petrol prices putting people off travel to them. But actually we didn't find that. Places where visitors arrived by car didn't have bad summers in appreciably higher proportions than respondents as a whole. So looking ahead to visitors and income in the next 6 months or so, museums not feeling optimistic, unfortunately. Pretty much nobody is expecting visitor numbers to be up compared to expectations. And it's important to remember that we were already talking about post-COVID projections, which were generally down on 2019 figures. I know a lot of museums weren't really expecting recovery to get going properly until 2023 or 2024 even. But now nobody, I would say, seems to really be expecting a recovery, hopefully at the beginning of next year. About a quarter of respondents expect visitor numbers to be 30% or more below initial expectations, which I'd consider kind of a pretty dire situation. About another quarter expect visitor numbers to be 29% or less below, which is more manageable, but still, of course, very, very difficult situation to be in. Income, slightly more optimistic, which again, interesting as mentioned before, but still difficult. There is here 10% of respondents who are projecting income to be above original projections. Maybe they're hopeful for new income streams, because their original projections were very cautious. For most museums, it's not looking so good. A quarter are expecting income to be a bit down. That's the 29% or below projections. About 1 in 5 really down. Interestingly, about a quarter of museums answering on this question hadn't reviewed their projections, and that was around 30 museums on the income side and a bit less on the visitors side. That might be a function of when we had the survey open, which was that period early to mid-September, right after the end of the summer holidays, and maybe those museums have looked since or looked now, but it's a pretty sizable number of museums that don't really know what they're expecting over the next 6 months. We are starting to see museums come forward as being at significant risk, which I'll come on to a bit later, and not understanding your numbers is, of course, a risk for that. perhaps unsurprisingly, it was almost wholly small museums that haven't been able to review their projections. That is something that AIM can support with, and support with our core audience of small museums. So we will be thinking about how we can support members with looking ahead and thinking about what the numbers might look like over the coming months. So the sector isn't feeling too positive, but what are the problems? And about a third of respondents gave us answers on this. Of those, mostly it's energy bills. Won't be a shock to anyone. 70% of museums said they were concerned about energy, and I will come on to that in more detail towards the end of the presentation. Nearly half are worried about staff costs, and in the free text boxes we heard quite a bit about that. Museums are worried about trying to help staff in their current climate. Of course, we know that the sector is not particularly well paid one. Several respondents talked about trying to provide bonuses, pay rises at inflation level, 9–10%, very difficult to find, and also difficulties recruiting. Also looking at that stat about staff costs, it's important to note that a lot of our small members are entirely or almost wholly volunteer run. So we didn't ask about volunteering in this survey, again, maybe next time, but a number of respondents again used the free text to talk about difficulty keeping and recruiting volunteers. But it does mean that staff cost statistic is pretty significant when you consider that a lot of our respondents potentially don't really have staff costs. Spending on goods and services for core activities is a problem for about half of respondents. We know all costs are going up. About a third of respondents are having issues with spending on capital projects. And again, from the free text, we know a particular challenge here is that capital project costs are going up, sometimes very sharply, but funders, which is both public funders and philanthropic, are not increasing awards. So museums are having to find savings elsewhere to get the same work done that was much cheaper, kind of 6 months or maybe a year ago when the applications were originally put together, or having to rescope projects and not able to get as much done with the same amount of money. So we also wanted to understand whether the pressures are mostly internal about rising costs or external about declining income, or pressures on audiences, really meaning that they are not coming. The impact on the museum is pretty much the same in terms of the books not balancing, but in advocacy terms, it might mean different solutions. So that was something we were interested in knowing about. For about a quarter of organisations, the main problem is increased costs. For about 1 in 6, it's decreased income, but for the majority, about 60%, it's a mix of both. And I think that really gets to the heart of the sector's problems at the moment, particularly for independent museums that don't get public funding, that are really working on running effective charitable businesses that kind of pay their own way and can do what they want. Costs are up, and options for solving that problem through increased income are few. So almost all museums, 90%, are taking some action to address cost pressures. Nearly 1 in 5 are looking at reducing opening hours or days, which is one of the most dramatic options on our list. About 2/3 are looking to increase income. 20% said through admissions, about a quarter said by events, including corporate hire, just under a third said by retail and hospitality. But a sizable minority, about 40%, just didn't think it was possible at the moment with everything else going up and audiences, and we're hearing corporate hire as well, anecdotally, is down due to pressures elsewhere in the economy. Nearly half of organisations are thinking about using reserves. We did find the reserves picture isn't too bad, perhaps because organisations were able to get reserves topped up through the Cultural Recovery Fund. 85% of respondents said they had some reserves. 70% have 3 months or more, which is a pretty good position to be in. But of course, that's high risk, because once those reserves are gone, they're gone. And that comes to something we'll be talking a bit more about later in the conclusions, which is the difficulty of not knowing whether this is one bad winter, in which case using reserves might be a good move. It's your rainy day money, it's raining, or whether actually these are going to be, these kinds of energy costs, these pressures are going to be much longer lasting, in which case using reserves now and no longer having that cushion is just pushing problems further down the line. We do know for some museums the difficult summer and the worsened outlook for the rest of this financial year means plans to top up reserves haven't been able to happen because the surplus income to do it hasn't been there, which is another difficult situation. There's also a lot of museums looking to reduce energy consumption, and that is, of course, a goal for environmental reasons as well, and is something the sector has been doing and wanting to do for a long time. But a lot of the ways to reduce significant energy use are medium or longer term measures. We did ask what people are doing more immediately. Responses included accessing grants for kind of quick energy efficient heating and lighting upgrades, reducing interior temperatures, changing damp controls, warm clothes and targeted heating for front of house colleagues, installing secondary glazing and keeping doors closed, and greater working from home and reduction of the time that staff are on site, so requiring heating. So there are lots of people thinking really hard about even the smallest action that that they can do to reduce energy consumption. About 40 museums have also scaled down work, so 1 in 6 are reducing public offer and events. Nearly a third of museums are postponing, cancelling or scaling back capital projects. 10% are changing plans for back of house collections work. So that does potentially have that knock-on effect, both in reduced public offer and reduced activity for audiences to come to, but also potentially reducing opportunities to future-proof organisations and to fresh displays, to do capital work that needs doing, including maintenance. So it's a long-term issue for some museums. There are staff implications. About 10% of museums are reducing staff hours, 10% have recruitment freezes, 10% are looking at employment restructures, where redundancies are being looked at. For half of museums, it'll affect less than a quarter of staff, but for nearly a fifth of those, it's between 3/4 and all staff. We didn't ask this time specifically about wellbeing, but 10% of museums said they were seeking support to help manage staff resilience. And we know that this is a very tired sector, that nobody had really recovered from what it took to get their organisations through COVID. And now people are being looked at to solve equally serious problems, and that any kind of reserve, I think, has run out for a lot of people. So again, that's kind of storing up problems for the longer term. We now come on to energy bills. Do need to say that the survey came out the same day the energy relief scheme was announced, but before any details were available, and those details, as you'll know, didn't come for quite some time. So people answered with their best current understanding, but the picture may have changed for some organisations which now know whether that rates cap will help them, but they've answered the questions not knowing how that would affect their bills. The key finding is that things are very different for different organisations, which is what we expected. About half of respondents to these questions on the energy bills were still within fixed terms. About 2/3 of those had more than 6 months left to run on their deal. That's a very different position for museums with that certainty around their lower prices, compared to the half that aren't in fixes, and again comes back to the crystal ball question of is this just one winter, or is this a semi-permanent or permanent state of affairs? Current energy bills average around 20% of total income, but this is a situation where averages are masking a very large range. So 16 museums said current energy bills are over 40% of their turnover. Picked 40% there because the average just about sustainable level as a proportion for energy bills was reported as 38%. So organisations on average said we can spend 38% of our turnover on energy bills, or we have reached a point where we cannot make things work and we would have to close. More than 70 museums are expecting their bills to rise by more than 50% in the next 6 to 12 months. And again, there is a huge range in that question. So we had some museums saying we expect them to go up 100%, probably somewhere they're expecting it to go up by more, others where the expected increase is much lower. So we have a small sample of local authority and university museums, as outlined earlier, but they did say they're expecting lower percentage rises in energy bills due to being part of wider deals across the parent organisation. So notwithstanding that those parts of the sector have their own challenges related to being local authority and university museums, I think it is a situation where we can say independent museums do seem to be facing greater challenges with energy bills. So coming on to the support that museums are looking for, only 10% said no additional need. Unsurprisingly, nearly half would like support specifically for energy bills. 18% would like core funding to the end of March, rising to 38% for core funding beyond April, which is an interesting one because it suggests that long tail of impact from cost pressures, and it's not just about energy bills through the winter. There is interest in one-off funding, particularly for maintenance. This links back to what we said earlier about long-term projects for upgrades, enabling the reduction of energy consumption. But 20% of museums would like immediate support to reduce that too. And just under 2/3 of museums feel there's a need for emergency grant funding that's culture specific, so similar to the Culture Recovery Fund. I wanted to finish the data bit on a slightly more optimistic note. And museums did report imminent or short-term risk of insolvency by Christmas or in the next 12 months in lower numbers than I had expected, although we have become aware in the last week or two of some museums coming forward. As ever, we encourage any museum at immediate risk to come forward to us or to another sector body to seek support and to make their situation known. So the conclusions that we want to draw from this data, first, that unlike with COVID, where problems were clear, consistent, coming fast, this crisis is affecting every organisation slightly differently. Some of you have got killer energy bills landing already, and that has put museums at imminent risk. Some are on fixes for another year, but visitor numbers are down. Some have got encouraging visitor numbers, but capital project costs have gone up and the funding hasn't. Some are fine with projects, but can't recruit. And of course, all sorts of combinations of those factors and others. So when the problem's different, the solutions have to look a bit different. And that is in contrast to the arguments that sector bodies were able to make around COVID and in the run-up to the Culture Recovery Fund, when pretty much everybody had the same problem: closed by COVID, closed by lockdowns, can't get any visitors in, can't get income. Now every museum is in a unique situation. And then, as mentioned previously, a major challenge for us as advocates and for funders as the problem solvers is that nobody knows how long this storm of difficult conditions will last. So there are, as outlined, calls for a new Culture Recovery Fund, but help through one winter is a very different thing to ask for compared to help through 2 or 3, or even longer term. It may be that we are simply looking at a permanent increase in operating costs for museums, and we need to figure out as a sector how to manage that. So I said I'd come back to how we're using the data. We are constantly in touch with governments and funding bodies, and we have shared the data with them. We are calling for emergency help where required, which, as things stand currently, is probably going to have to come from the sector's existing resources. We are calling for a long-term plan, especially if it seems that higher energy prices and economic difficulties reducing audience demand are here to stay for a while. We're looking at how we can support members through the AIM offer, which includes through resilience and peer support for leaders and on help and advice with reducing energy consumption. We'll be asking funders to look at existing projects and to not put all the pressure to keep costs down on the funded organisations. We do have a great opportunity right now. So the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, BEIS, is carrying out a review to decide which sectors should be considered vulnerable in the energy crisis, and offered support beyond the initial 6 months of the September announcement. And we are awaiting a commission from DCMS, which will enable them to feed into that review. It's going to be a very quick commission, with probably a 2-week turnaround, we understand. So we have agreed with other sector bodies that we'll all work together to develop the museum's response. And because AIM members completed the survey and told us what was happening, we will be able to feed in robust data and information, which is really positive. And we know it's more or less the right information because of having asked DCMS what they needed to know when we wrote the survey. And we know that a lot of parts of arts, culture and heritage sectors haven't done these kinds of surveys yet. So won't really be able to put forward what's really going on in detail, but thanks to you, thanks to our members, we can and we can feed that in on behalf of the whole museum sector, and you can know that your concerns are being represented where it matters.